Well, joining me now on the world to discuss Trump's executive order threatening to impose tariff sanctions on countries that trade with Iran is Hamilton Odunze, who is an international affairs analyst. He joins me from Boston, Massachusetts. Good to have you this weekend. First off, what countries are most likely to be affected by these tariffs on countries by Trump if that particular, executive order begins?
So the impact will differ across countries, but the countries most affected are China, the UAE, Turkey, and India. This is because these countries are major trading partners of Iran and also hold significant export trade with the United States. For example, China accounts for 90% of Iran's oil trade in recent years, making it Iran's primary trading partner. However, China has more leverage in a tariff war with the United States as we've seen in the past, because of the size of its economy than a country like, say, Turkey. A country like Turkey is highly exposed due to significant trade with Iran and high exports to the US. European nations and other Asian buyers will also be affected as tariffs will force a deeper reliance on China for Iranian trade.
Well, Odunze, how do you think Iran would respond to these tariffs? And could this escalation lead to a wider conflict in the region? Iran isn't new to sanctions or sanctioning positions, so I'm wondering if this would impact the country in any way.
Correct. So Iran has been under sanctions for years. It is likely that it has already developed a default response system, even as its economy grinds through difficult times. We expect Iran to foster deeper economic alliances with targeted nations like China, Turkey, and Iraq to bypass sanctions. China has helped Iran circumvent sanctions in the past. Iran may also use threats to argue that the US is violating international norms, and they would threaten that American interests in the region would become legitimate targets if the United States or Israel uses force. As talks with the United States continue next week, Iran may also decide to use a back channel to reduce tensions or leisure.
Can sanctions and tariffs effectively pressure Iran to change its policies, or will they primarily harm the Iranian people if that is done by, Trump?
The sanctions and tariffs effectively, what they do is they effectively restrict Iran's economic growth and isolate its financial sector from the global market. Sanctions also hinder Iran's oil exports, creating significant economic pressure and domestic frustration. However, these sanctions have not fundamentally compelled Iran to change its regional behavior or its nuclear ambitions. To circumvent these restrictions, Iran has often relied on shadow networks and trade with China. We expect Iran to continue to use China as a back channel in these circumstances, Olije.
How might China, since you've highlighted the fact that this could affect, China, how might China, Iran's largest trading partner, respond to these tariffs? And what implications could this have for US-China relations?
Well, analysts expect China to respond through a combination of strategic diplomacy and targeted maneuvering. China will aim to protect its economic interests while steering clear of full-scale, uncontrolled economic war. Uh, China has committed to taking all necessary measures to safeguard its rights and signal potential countermeasures against the United States. Possible responses include imposing retaliatory tariffs targeting U.S. companies or diversifying trade partnerships. However, despite the strong rhetoric, China is expected to act strategically, seeking to apply pressure without inflicting excessive economic damage on itself.
What are the potential, consequences for regional stability in the Middle East, and how could neighboring countries be affected by this?
Well, the situation forces countries to choose between trading with the United States or Iran. This will disrupt regional supply chains, likely increase costs, for the people on the street, for the common man, and further isolate Iran from, economically For instance, the UAE, a major buyer of Iranian fuel, faces significant pressure to halt its trade with Iran to maintain access to US market and explore other options. Additionally, China is also likely to continue prioritizing its more profitable relationship with the Gulf states over a risky, heavily sanctioned Iran.
That leads me to this, right? Amidst all of this that Trump is saying, we know that Steve Witkoff and Iranian officials are discussing in Oman. But how will this move impact diplomatic efforts to resolve tensions between the U.S. and Iran?
Well, what we know is every time tariffs are imposed or proposed, they threaten diplomacy by weaponizing global trade and forcing countries to choose new partners or forge new alliances. In this case, countries must decide whether to prioritize the US market or maintain economic ties with Iran. Trump's strategy aims to deepen Iran's economic isolation, but it also risks creating significant diplomatic friction. As a result, we may see the formation of new alliances, even retaliatory actions by partners such as China, but Iran and the US have indicated that the diplomatic talks in Oman, as you mentioned last week, were productive, and they expect to continue discussions next week.
Right. Hamilton, do you have knowledge of any alternative economic strategies that could, more effectively address Iran's nuclear ambitions and regional influence?
Yes, several approaches beyond tariffs can be considered. Efforts can be directed towards cutting off funding, limiting access to technology, and using international financial systems to increase the cost of uranium enrichment. These alternative strategies may include maximum pressure campaigns, such as restricting oil exports, imposing secondary sanctions on third-party traders, including intelligence-driven initiatives to target front companies. However, it is important to note that while these methods have succeeded in reducing Iran's GDP and limiting its resources, they have not completely stopped its nuclear program.
And then finally, what are the long-term implications of this move for U.S. foreign policy, and how could it shape the future of international relations?
Yeah, the long-term impact is likely to result in a more fragmented global economic landscape, with increased illicit trade partnerships among sanctioned countries. The goal of sanctioning Iran ultimately, may have the opposite effect. Instead of fully isolating Iran, this policy is likely to push Iran to depend even more on China. This could enable China to acquire Iranian oil at significant discounts, and over the long term, effectively create a new bloc of sanctioned nations or region.
Hoping that, the talks in Oman continues despite Trump's, executive order.
Correct.
Thank you so much, Hamilton, for joining us on The World Today.